Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Alan Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep. Well, Alistair, you're looking well. What are we going to talk about in the Alan Juddy Show today?
Well, Glenn, we're going to be talking about fescues, and we're going to cover off the basic ways of identifying fescue. We're going to talk about its natural environments. We're going to go through a bit of history and the path that Agricom particularly has taken with tall fescue in New Zealand and in recent times Meadow Fescue. We're going to talk about why we use tall fescue, the future of using Meadow Fescue in mixtures with tall fescue, the farm systems that best suit tall fescue. We're going to discuss persistence and what drives persistence with tall fescue and endophytes, and discuss common issues we face with tall fescue, which leads on to grazing management and circles back to why we are genuinely interested in meadow fescue as part of this discussion. So it is a story not about tall fescue, but about fescues and their use in New Zealand agriculture.
And if you're still with us at the end, I'm going to give you Juddy's top 5 grazing tips for tall fescue. So look out for that.
Well, shit, I'm really looking forward to that, Glenn.
Yeah, towards the end. So let's start off with fescues, and probably we're going to be talking about tall fescue and meadow fescue. And for you taxonomic tragics out there, we're talking about festucas and Festuca arundinacea, which is actually the tall fescue, and Festuca pratensis, which is at the meadow fescue. And I guess we probably should start a little bit by working out how you'd identify that. So if you picture this, a cow walks into a bar and there's a whole lot of grass-looking plants around. How, Alistair, would the cow recognise where the fescue is?
Well, without getting into too much taxonomy, because to be quite frank, I have forgotten a lot of that, tall fescue itself is a broader and coarser plant. It's got a larger and thicker tillers than what we see in ryegrass, particularly. Its leaves are defined by having tram lines. Interesting enough, the little veins in both ryegrass and fescue leaves, the veins on ryegrass are in a V shape, while the veins on the leaf of a tall fescue plant are in almost like a wee rectangle, like a tram line. Oh. And sometimes you have to bend those leaves over your finger to look across them because they're quite small, but it's quite a distinct thing. On average, though, fescue is a little bit coarser in the leaf and under the same vegetative state is noticeably coarser. If you ask the same question about meadow fescue, it's a much softer and less rigid plant. It's quite different in many ways, and we'll probably discuss it when we get into the species differences later. But it is a much shinier, much more ryegrass looking plant, and it's got some quite distinct differences.
So when maybe one of the key ones is when we get seed head, the seed heads are quite different between ryegrass and tall fescue, for example. Can you give me the sort of key differences you'd be looking for?
Yeah, it's a very distinct difference. Ryegrass has a single seed head and the seed is literally connected to the main stem. Actually, we're looking at this picture to our left, which some of you on the podcast will not see. But the reality is fescues have panicles, which basically are branches off the main stem where the seed are connected to. So they are distinct in the sense that they've got seed of an equivalent size of a diploid ryegrass, but they're on branches that come off the main seed head, and that's quite a distinct difference between that and ryegrass.
I think you've given people on the podcast an excellent mental picture of what that difference is.
If you're watching on YouTube, I could actually point to it up here. It's one of these species with panicle seed heads, and we've got some fescue species just here, and you can see the branches. So that's not going to come through well on podcast, but the reality is it's a nice...
Tell me about some of the differences that we might see underground Is there any differences in roots between, say, a perennial ryegrass and a fescue?
Yes, I'm going to bring, so you used the word fescue, and in this case we are discussing tall fescue and meadow fescue, and it's really worth dragging the difference out between the two fescue species, but using ryegrass as our standard. Ryegrass has got a fine, dense root structure, and it is a very good scavenger for the top 15 or so centimetres of the topsoil. Tall fescue has got a deep root structure that can penetrate a lot deeper than ryegrass, has a larger proportion of its total root mass at a deeper level. Those roots are also more shaped like dreadlocks. As you move further and further down the plant, they actually are quite thick, and it's quite a distinct difference. It means that they can push holes in soil and go deeper in many different soil types. Now that is tall fescue. Meadow fescue actually has a root structure much more similar to ryegrass. So although they're both fescue species, they're actually very differently shaped underground, and meadow fescue's root structure would be far more comparable to a diploid perennial ryegrass, and yet they're both fescue.
So that's a really good takeaway message, which you might come to at the end, that, in terms of rooting, or the roots of tall fescue, for example, just think dreadlocks, but probably fescues can't reggae, but dreadlocks in terms of that the style of root there. So we might come back to that. I guess the other question is, and this will help us when we look at the different farm systems, but what sort of natural environments do you find tall fescues in? Where is it at home?
Yeah, and this is quite interesting, because a few of the listeners will have to disengage where they're actually using it on their farms, because we use tall fescue because of the traits we've just mentioned: deep root structures, quite resilient plant, but where it's actually, so we take it out to some pretty dry places and pretty hard environments. But where tall fescue is naturalised and where it's happiest is in floodplains. So deep organic soils, high fertility environments that can be waterlogged for periods of the year, and therefore they've built up a lot of organic matter. And that is the absolute natural place for tall fescue. And anywhere around the world, like if we changed our farm systems and we just sort of left the landscape right now, the vast majority of our floodplains, our deep high water table floodplains, would revert to tall fescue, and then it would be a natural gradient from the tall fescue in our floodplains to a location where ryegrass would still survive, and then would move out towards Coxford and the lower rainfall, lighter, less fertile environments.
Somewhere back in my memory, I think I can remember that it also copes with higher environmental temperature. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Just a little bit, without a lot of absolute detail, because we have listeners from all around the world. In the case of United States and Europe, tall fescue is a continental plant at heart, and fundamentally is very good in cold environments. It can tolerate very low temperatures in those countries, and that's where it's naturalised, in those floodplains, in those regions. We've identified plants that have more winter activity for our temperate environment, although nowhere near the winter activity of ryegrass, and that's one of those production trade-offs between going for the resilience of tall fescue in the right situation to actually when the feed comes, and we'll cover that at a later date. Just going back though into these sites, it's developed in these high fertility environments, and although we take it into tougher environments, particularly dryland, I can't emphasise enough, it's a plant of high fertility. It's not a medium to high fertility plant. And so when we take it up into some of our stations in New Zealand, our sheep and beef operations, we've got to always remember that fertility is one of the true drivers of its true longevity in some of those landscapes. We tend to find it gets outcompeted by brown top and other species once your Olsen peas or your phosphate levels start to decline. It's not a plant of aggressive phosphate harvesting, for example. It requires good thing. So it's suited to heavier soils, and yet the resilience of it as a resilient grass with a big root structure means we take it out onto a lot of light country.
So, in terms of cultivars, I guess we could explore. You've talked about, it's a continental plant and it is in a number of different systems around the world. Give us a brief and history of the types of tall fescues that, particularly in New Zealand, that we've had on offer.
Well, it's been interesting. That's an interesting segue into using a little bit of the history of where we've been at Agricom with tall fescue development. Is one of the weaknesses of tall fescue, as we'll pick up later with the grazing management, is that it's got quite a more lignified leaf. It's never quite the outright quality of ryegrass, even in a vegetative state. When leaves are left, they can go quite fibrous and quite coarse. So one of the traits that have always been sitting in the background of tall fescue is palatability and softness.
Softness of leaf.
Yeah, correct. But there's been two categories of tall fescue that have existed for a very long time, and we've kept this very, very high level. And until the diversity of flowering dates have developed in ryegrass, we've actually kept the discussion of flowering date to tall fescue very, very simplistic. There are early tall fescues and there are late tall fescues, and you've tended to find that early tall fescues have been the highest producing, the most resilient, and the reality is often the less palatable. The late flowering tall fescues have held quality through early spring and into mid-spring at a much greater level, and the development of late flowering tall fescues for quality has been a much easier road. And at a very basic level, particularly in New Zealand, we've done a little bit of a disservice when we're discussing the management of tall fescue. We've just described them as early and late. As a farmer in New Zealand, you don't have a clue what that means. So it took us a number of years to acknowledge this and actually put some dates around this. But to put that in perspective, an early tall fescue of the high yielding, resilient styles tends to have about a minus 20 day flowering date compared to Nui, which sits at about middle to the late part of the second month of spring, and a late tall fescue may be about 10 days later than Nui. So that's the range that you see compared to ryegrass, and so on average fescue can be quite early.
Yeah, I think we'll pick up on that in terms of the way we use it, but also some of the problems that we come with that. That's an implication of that, that the earliness of the tall fescue.
Absolutely. So just going into the cultivars though, this has led this change. With ag research breeding, the first generation of tall fescues we were involved in at Agricom, the commercialisation of a variety called Roa was a major step forward in quality for tall fescue, and so that took us through, I think, the late 80s into the 90s, and we saw the emergence of another variety called Advance, which is another generation on from Roa, and the focus of this would have been focused on seed production particularly, because seed production of tall fescue, particularly the high quality lates, is not always straightforward. And then we, somewhere around the late 2000s, we released another generation out of the Advanced family called Eastern. And all of these were a late style, as I've defined. But in the about the mid 2010s, we released our first generation of what really has been a new generation of high quality early flowering tall fescues, and that variety at Agricom is called Hummer. And it was a bit of a breakthrough for us because, as I say, the history is all the early flowering styles have always been the coarsest and the hardest to manage. And Hummer has got a much softer leaf from its style and has made quite a big change in plant type. Finer leaf, finer and a much easier grazing proposition throughout the calendar year. But it's still only the most recent generation. We've got another one on the way, and I'm looking forward to that because the traits that's going to bring builds on that movement forward we've made with Hummer in that space, particularly of the resilient early flowering types.
So we probably now should turn our attention to what are the actual attributes of a tall fescue plant and sward that give benefits to a grazing system, for example. So what are the characteristics of that, and then we can talk about the farming systems that follow on from that. So tall fescue, describe what the key characteristics of those swards are.
Well, to touch on one thing, is one of the possible weaknesses, if you haven't used tall fescue a lot and you've been a ryegrass user, one of the initial weaknesses is actually one of the strengths of tall fescue, and that is it's actually really slow to get established. It's not a fast tiller. It doesn't tiller and form cover as fast as ryegrass, and so it will, if you're a ryegrass user, it will probably be between 60 and 70% behind what you expect at first grazing from a ryegrass. But on the other side of that is that it's really positive for legume establishment. And so getting white clover and red clover established in tall fescue is outstanding. And once established, they are really resilient inside a fescue stand. The traits of being a bigger tilled plant that is more resilient in the crown provides quite a lot of protection to particularly white clover, but it fits red clover extremely well. I'll just do a quick shout out in this situation is that regularly in the New Zealand system, tall fescue is defined by how great the legume content is. I would really encourage people to think seriously against leaving legumes out when getting tall fescue established. Regularly with slow establishing pastures, some people are really concerned about weed control and particularly hard to kill weeds. And there is a school of thought that sometimes leaving the legume out gives you more options to control weeds. With the fescue species, I highly, highly recommend against that, even though it's slow establishing and the weed burden can be a little bit greater. You never get the legume content in a tall fescue stand that you would get from your first establishment phase. So this is pretty much a shout out. If you're going to put tall fescue in, please always put your legume in at sowing and work your way around your weed control management afterwards.
Yeah, in my experience, I've also come up against that slow establishing speed. Yeah. And I guess my message really is that you'll forget about how slow it was to establish long after you appreciate the beautiful sward that you get with lots of clover through that and a lovely balance of the grass. So, it's a little bit painful to start with, but you are rewarded, greatly with the style of pasture you've got. What else have we got from those pastures?
So one of the keys, and I think you've appreciated this most, and probably, how would I say it, it's defined some of your experience, particularly in our beef unit, associated with the early flowering fescue is this incredible reliability of early season growth over and above any other species, and that is because the flowering date is so advanced. Acknowledging that something like our tall fescue Hummer is a minus 20 to 21 day variety, it means it's throwing its first seed head in a pasture at the end of our September, the first month of spring, and actively growing anywhere between 4 and 5 to 6 weeks before that, which means although not very winter active, by the end of August, it's lighting up and fundamentally exploding through that September period, which is reliably a month earlier than ryegrass is fully firing, basically.
And I think the other key aspect to that is, yes, it's early, and we often term the king of spring because there's nothing else really that can provide that amount of feed that early in the year. But the other key part about it, and you've touched on that, is the reliability of that. If you're having a cooler season, because this is largely driven by day length and the fact that this plant is getting set up for flowering, even if you're in a colder year, you still get to a greater extent that flush of feed coming in. So it's very reliable.
To be fair, it's more important in a cold environment because in a warm climate, for example, as you head further north in New Zealand, the reality is you've got warmer conditions, you've got more mineralisation of nitrogen, you've got a larger nitrogen response rate in your pastures, which means suddenly the need for early spring growth can be done at a vegetative level because temperature is giving you those advantages. As you get colder and colder, the reality is your mineralisation of natural soil available in is slower. Your day lengths, as you go south in New Zealand, you're limited by day length quite regularly. And as you've already alluded to, temperature is slow to move and through August and September. And so technically, you're not getting the response rates from nitrogen, for example, was a good example, but with tall fescue, because it is starting to go reproductive, it is forcing that growth regardless of climatic conditions. And the onset of tiller elongation is actually vegetative growth. And it's our job as farmers and advisors to capture that before it becomes stem, full-blown stem, and then drops in quality and becomes a problem at a later date.
And that's a really good segue into the next thing I absolutely love about fescue, about tall fescue, is this fact that it flowers once. Maybe 1.5 times, but really by the time we get through that 1.5 sort of flowering events, we're back to a vegetative growth very quickly. And so being able to manage the quality in a fescue pasture should be easier.
Yeah, correct. It's amazing how it's portrayed as a hurdle, but the reality is that you have some ryegrasses that can take up to 3 to 4 months to get fully back to vegetative state and not throw stem in their pasture. With tall fescue, particularly a product like Hummer, you have about 1.5 months, and by November, you're actually got a completely clean pasture of which you're able to set up and move forward for a high-quality forage. Grazing events and silage. I would just touch on one thing we probably could still say about why using tall fescue is that I've mentioned its resilience in cooler environments for providing early growth and it's just its constant delivery. The other thing that is quite special coming out of a continental environment, it's got a higher growth threshold in warmer conditions. And I feel for some of our more droughted environments, we've got to all acknowledge as we start a discussion about growing at higher temperature, that actually doesn't work if there's no moisture. And I feel that comes back to the whole floodplain discussion and the high water tables. If you've got a deep organic soil and you've got moisture somewhere in the soil profile, tall fescue can consistently grow at higher temperatures than ryegrass. That slowly shuts off because it's a temperate plant in the late 20s degrees Celsius. And the reality is tall fescue can push on quite a long way further on, including nighttime temperatures as well. So it's something to discuss why you would use tall fescue. If you're in a hot environment, you're discussing water use efficiency, you're wanting to stay green, and you've got good soils to deliver that. Tall fescue is one of those species that will keep you green in a brown environment if you've got good soil.
Yeah. One of the other things that's really good about fescue, and I appreciate this in terms of the areas I look after, is there is this, and maybe it's only perceived, you'll be able to tell me, this tolerance or resilience to grass scrub. Now, you'll be interested to know, I actually interviewed a grass scrub once, and I actually didn't get a lot out of it, but I'm hoping that you can help me with this. What the resilience to grass scrub, those root feeders in fescue relative to ryegrass? Tell me a little bit about that. Why do we see a greater resilience in terms of our tall fescues?
I think that's a practical description of the existing root structure difference between tall fescue and ryegrass. Ryegrass has got a fine fibrous root structure, and you tend to find New Zealand native grass scrub is a scarab that lays its eggs in November, December, and they hatch in the autumn, and they are root feeders that are quite aggressive, and they can get to very, very large populations. It's not unheard of in parts of New Zealand to be up over 200 grass scrub per metre square. So they're a white crescent-shaped larvae. Now, these little guys, the reality still with them is that they can only eat so much. And the more organic matter, more root mass you have underground, the more mouths you can feed before you damage the physical plant. And I think it is as simple as that. You add then hot, dry conditions, and the summers tend to be the time of year when there is a lot of root mass shrinking under the plant, and then autumn's a time that root mass builds under the plant as the plant transfers carbohydrate back into the pseudostem and the root structure. Now, once you started to thin out a little bit through summer because the plant's getting exhausted in all the heat, the soil can be so hot and the root structures are shrinking, then you unleash a whole lot of little larvae underground chewing through your root structures. Again, the biomass that you have is a great protection other than the very highest populations, of which tall fescue will eventually still collapse at the rates I've just quoted, that are greater than 150 to 200 grass scrub per metre square. But ryegrass would be dead after 50 to 60 grass scrub per metre square. So tolerance is high.
Yeah, tolerance is high because of the higher root mass.
Correct.
Grass scrub is still eating that.
Correct.
But higher root mass, and therefore you've got to have a higher population to get damaged.
Correct.
Well, that's a whole lot more than Gary the grass scrub actually gave me. So I thank you for that. There's
Exactly.
And now, if we can move on, because we've talked about tall fescue, but there's this other fescue species called Meadow Fescue, and maybe what we should do is just looking at the same. Why would you use a meadow fescue? If we can compare and contrast between the tall and meadow fescue, because I guess at the end of it we're going to say these two things together would be quite awesome. So let's just look at the meadow fescue. We've said this is a much more ryegrass like plant. Let's look at the why would you use it, contrasting it with tall fescue.
Well, there's a little bit of history that I'm not privy to the exact detail, but as far as I understand, in about the 50s, about 50 tonne of meadow fescue was imported into New Zealand. And it's really important to understand that it literally naturalised nowhere in New Zealand outside Northland. The only existing records of any meadow fescue surviving in New Zealand is in Northland, and there's a couple of reasons for that are a bit surprising. It is again a European continental plant, which means it's winter dormant. It doesn't grow a lot in our primary 3 winter months. It probably shuts down, depending on the exact location, probably a half a month either side of that. So you might as well say it's got a 4 month dormancy window. Yep. And with that, it's not a particularly productive plant.
So this is really interesting. We're saying there's a role for this, but at the moment I'm not hearing anything good about this plant.
And that's the part to rationalise, because there are good things about this plant, but they also need to be understood about the context and its true reality of what it actually is. So if I was to sort of break it down, we have commercialised a variety of meadow fescue called Oakton. It's sort of a niche product, but I've had a couple of epiphanies, and the reality is I've found some very, very good functional roles for it that now we're generating some serious confidence. For starters, this particular variety is I can't quite remember, but I think it's about a plus 12 flowering date compared to Nui, so it would be described as a late flowering species relative to our ryegrass categories. As I've mentioned, its root mass is more similar to ryegrass than tall fescue. So if you're thinking about layers of roots, if you sort of mix a tall fescue and a meadow fescue together, their roots would actually be working at different areas in the soil profile as well. It hasn't really got the heat tolerance because it's a sort of a northern European species that tall fescue has. So it's interesting that it found a niche survival in Northland of all places, but it probably has something more to do with that. It's got a natural endophyte, and that endophyte is quite active, and it produces alkaloids called lolines, and these are identified at really high volumes in both the roots and the leaves of the meadow fescue. And these lolines are a group of an alkaloid that fundamentally is quite impressive for insect control for a certain range of insects, and there does appear to be boosting these moderately shallow, fine root structures. The endophyte seems to be boosting their resilience beyond their size, their depth, and their shape in the soil. And so meadow fescue seems to be more effective underground, even though it's not outrageously impressive underground.
So, guess in summary, it's the endophyte that we find in this fescue species, which is really useful, we think, in areas where we may have these root feeders.
Correct.
Is there anything else that meadow fescue could bring to a pasture, benefits to a pasture, apart from these root feeders?
Well, it has the same establishment speed as tall fescue. If anything, slightly stronger. It seems to tiller a little bit faster, and that's a positive because improved tillering from an establishment phase, especially when you're still not as aggressive as ryegrass, means that you are competing against some of those weeds we were discussing earlier. So you're not suppressing clover. It is actually outstanding for getting clover established as well. but you're also filling out your rows just a little bit more faster and a little bit more reliably, which is one of the weaknesses of tall fescue. Now, I've talked about its establishment speed being a little bit better than tall fescue, but it would appear they're very complementary. Right here and now, I would not recommend without deliberate thought the mixing of ryegrass and tall fescue. Tall fescue seed is very expensive and ryegrass is very aggressive. And the reality is that ryegrass will dominate tall fescue establishment to a really detrimental level, and you'll have spent a lot of money on tall fescue seed only to get it virtually wiped out by fast establishing aggressive ryegrass. So you have to think about how you would ever do that. Mixing tall fescue and meadow fescue is quite a different story because they're establishing at a very similar speed, although meadow fescue slightly more. Meadow fescue is tillering slightly faster, and in doing that, you're seeing row integrity, the emergence of ground cover happening at a slightly more reliable level than just fescue by itself, while not compromising anything else getting established with it.
Do we think so? Great. We've got a pasture that's establishing at a similar speed. It's filling out nicely. It's also helping with those clovers. We've got an endophyte which is taking care of, or at least having a positive impact on those root feeders. Is there anything there for the grazing animal?
Well, that's possibly. I'd step back one other really critical point because it does sound pretty cool, but in all our information to date, and probably south of the northern half of the northern part of New Zealand, meadow fescue would only produce around about 76 to 80% of what ryegrass would per annum. So it does have a really big check to total productivity. Tall fescue would sit anywhere between 100% of ryegrass to even 110% of ryegrass. And both species, if ryegrass dies, would obviously have a lay down misere and have a complete win for dry matter production. But ryegrass just doesn't drop dead everywhere. So the key there is that it's not actually that productive. However, it's highly palatable, Glenn, and that's the wee part you were driving at, and that's the epiphany I had, is that by itself, it's interesting, but in a mixture with tall fescue, it appears to have a great synergy in that they both work together, one to produce the reliable dry matter, the other to elevate palatability of the total sward. And we've got probably about 4 years experience now to suggest that this mixture is actually one of the ways forward for fescue use in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think that's when the first time I saw this, it was really surprising that you could mix a highly palatable grass with one that you might argue is at the lower end of palatability, and that sward started to behave like the most palatable grass in there.
Yeah. It's not halfway.
No, it's not halfway.
Yeah, it's above halfway for productivity,
Yep.
And it's above halfway between the two constitutes of the primary grass part for production.
And in half and half paddocks, you can see the difference in terms of grazing. So the animals have got it's quite startling, and the mechanics behind that probably still don't understand, but it's a really interesting visual when you look at that those two parts of the paddock are grazed quite differently, which is a real benefit, and it is probably one of the key reasons why you would look at doing this. You're not going to lose too much. You may lose a little bit from the production from that meadow fescue, but actually the benefits you get from a grazing management point of view is quite startling, and we'll cover that as we get to.
We should move on to that, but before we leave the meadow fescue, for some of my colleagues and farmers in Australia, particularly in our big tall fescue belts, I would highlight that we've done enough research on meadow fescue to know that Australia is just too hot for it, and the reality is it's died out relatively quickly. So just also remember that we've had to do our due diligence on the variety that we're using. There's many things that can kill grass other than some of these root feeders, and if overgrazed in a low fertility situation with extreme temperatures, meadow fescue is not a strong plant. It's not a natural naturalizer or a strong survivor in true stressful environments. You have to get most things right, and when we use fescue pastures in New Zealand particularly, you're trying to get more things right, and that helps that combination.
So now we've talked about the attributes to the pasture, we probably could have a farm systems discussion about what are the systems that we find tall fescue works really well in. Where would you, and maybe the ones that it doesn't work very well in, because it's a really good discussion to go, where would you not put it, and what sings out for having a fescue pasture as at least a component of a system.
Well, for starters, and I think in a previous podcast, I think it was on endophyte that I actually did a call out, because people like bagging ryegrass quite a lot in a lot of regions in New Zealand, and it's quite frustrating. Here we are talking about fescues and all their strengths that actually, I'm pretty sure many of you would say, tick a lot of boxes for what you're wanting to achieve and do on farm, but a few people have just seen the hurdles to using fescue too great that they're prepared to put up with what ryegrass offers and not try fescue. And again, that's why the mixture becomes a very interesting opportunity, I believe, is that I think the tall fescue, meadow fescue mixture in the future is going to be an intermediate step to understand as fescue for you. But looking at the systems particularly, so in a big chunk of New Zealand, we do a lot of crop-based animal wintering, and these are animals that are out there on brassica crop, particularly through winter. And what you tend to find is we can hold them pretty well through to the end of winter, but what you've done is you've held animals back and you've kept them on crop for as long as feasible, but of course the crop will not last forever, and then you're wanting to unleash these animals on a big spring profile. However, in many parts of New Zealand, although we are warming, we can only maintain such a certain amount of cover, and so therefore we can only accumulate so much feed for when the animals have finished crop. So what you're really looking for is a large cover, something that's going to boom as soon as you come off crop and you've held a lot of cattle on, that you can have great confidence that it's just going to grow underneath those animals coming off crop. So it fits extremely well into cattle systems, and you tend to find, again, like I described, the majority of cattle systems have been held in our system on crop in winter, and you're unleashing them onto emerging cover. But many of the countries that we're parts of our country that we're using brassica crops to winter on are also quite cold, which means September is not a guaranteed feed period in our landscape. And when I say September, I mean the first month of spring. And as you've heard with early flowering tall fescue that we're working with, September is one of its strengths, regardless of the climatic conditions. So it fits so terribly well into those cattle systems, Juddy.
And I think just on that, the other way of having feed on hand for that end of winter is to actually accumulate it from autumn.
Correct.
Right? But one of the big, and that's what we've probably done in the past, is used ryegrass and accumulated some winter growth and some stuff that was accumulated in the late autumn. But actually with fescue, the problem with doing that is the quality of that. We've got a build up of dead material. We've got a lot of maybe rusts and funguses, which can live on that grass, and the quality of that then isn't quite as high compared to fresh growth growing
under the animals.
And so that's another benefit of being able to grow it when you need it, or closer to when you need it, rather than having to drag it from other parts of the year with the inability to maintain quality.
So cattle fattening systems particularly would be a great example. Now that has great synergy with early lambing systems as well. So probably I would separate and define that a little bit, because our true winter lambing systems, fescue probably isn't for you. The reality is, if you're lambing in the middle of winter in New Zealand, you're in a warmer landscape. It still may be drought affected, which means that ryegrass may not be perfect, but its winter activity is undeniably the best of all the grass species we have, which fundamentally means if you're lambing in the middle of winter, you probably want a ryegrass base, and that allows you to use that autumn activity and the actual winter growth of ryegrass to lamb onto. Now, if you move your lambing date into the very first month of spring, that's probably defining you much too cold to lamb in the middle of winter. It also means that you're actually you've got the window of time that you believe your animals, your growth will meet your animal demand, but the climate often has other ideas. And September can be quite a difficult month. And again, we've just defined fescue as such a strong plant in September that under set stocking with ewes and lambs, tall fescue fits very, very well because it's a very palatable time when it's actively growing. You can deliver quite high stocking rates. I think on average, a standard stocking rate on a good pasture may be about 10 twin-bearing ewes per hectare in a New Zealand system. The key to fescue is that you're likely to want to do that at about 14 twin-bearing ewes per hectare because the active growth underneath those ewes is going to be quite dramatic and quite functional. That's the type of system that would benefit greatly. I wouldn't describe it as being widely used in just the straight lambing, the ewe capital stock lambing system. I think it does fit, probably has a greater fit in the cattle-based systems. But we go on to a couple of other scenarios around farm system fit.
And this is really important because you go, right, where you're needing feed early, this is great. This is something that you should be thinking about. However, there are a couple of things that are really critical. That this is like the devil in the detail. And one of them really is around moisture, right, in terms of how wet these areas get. Because if you've got great growth coming really early, but this area is wet and it's difficult to get on or graze without damage, then you've got a pasture that needs grazing, but you can't graze it.
Correct. And I think that leads into that other farm system that tall fescue benefits greatly is some of the dairy environments of New Zealand, particularly in the upper North Island and areas that want to utilise water well. I think on free draining soils where you're using irrigation, tall fescue fits very, very well on a dairy farm, particularly focused on the second round. It is literally a grass that is dynamic in that second round, just as we've discussed. If you go back, though, to the wetter natural rainfall environments, remember what we described at the start as floodplains. And so a lot of dairy farms in New Zealand are situated on high fertility sort of floodplains. And fescue is a logical species for many of those environments, particularly in the tougher environments of the North Island. But again, you don't want to be too wet, just as you've described, because you've got bigger cows coming in and needing to graze on a regular cycle, but we're needing to move and utilise it on a regular basis. So we probably need to be very wary of not being too wet when it comes to the dairy system.
One of the strategies that we can use if we can't get stock to that is wrapping this up as silage. Yeah, so does this wrap up really well as silage?
Absolutely, and it's probably one of the go-to control mechanisms if the seed head gets away on you. Seed head getting away on tall fescue is no different to losing quality in a ryegrass stand, and regularly you'd either top it and or take it for silage as a control. Again, people see that as a negative for the use of tall fescue, but I can't quite work that out because we actually do that with ryegrass as well.
Maybe at just a different time.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So I guess what I think we should do to kind of wrap this up is talk a little bit about the common issues that people see with that, and then I'm going to give my Juddy's top 5 tips of grazing tall fescue to try and address some of those. So as you travel around, what are the 3 things that farmers say to you about the challenges with having fescue in their farming system?
I think if we were to really sum it up, they would describe it as possibly less quality than a ryegrass stand. And I can't emphasise enough, that is why you must always keep your legume contents as consistent as possible in a tall fescue stand. But poor quality only reflects the fact that there are other options that are better. If you're in a brown landscape and you've got green tall fescue, the reality is that poor quality is not right. I mean, it is the best thing in the right landscape. It's got low autumn growth because it's putting so much resource into its roots, and that is a time that is quite important for some farming systems. So autumn growth is a genetic target for myself personally to select our breeders and encourage our breeders to work on, because for some of our colder environments, particularly in the lambing systems, for example, the ram is going out late and you need your ewes body condition to be moving forward at quite a late time of year. And if you've got a lot of tall fescue and it's not growing, that doesn't help that tupping time frame. So low autumn growth is a potential negative of tall fescue that we are getting around with genetic gain. And the great perspective of the grazing, difficult grazing management, and it is a constant frustration to me with the grazing management discussion, is that actually if you have grass, we just encourage you to graze it. And I don't quite get how that growing a lot of grass at critical points of time is a grazing management problem. And it's because we're quite rigid with different staffing policies around rotations and what paddocks we go back to and what order we graze paddocks in. But if you're not constrained to coming back to the same paddock on a given time frame, tall fescue grazing management is that you just follow where the growth is. And I really can't work out why that is such a difficult part of the discussion. However, we are breaking that down with the Meadow Fescue mixes, and that is one of the areas that I really believe we're going to have a bit of a breakthrough in grazing management.
Excellent. Righto, well, grab your pen or your pencil, or in your case, Alistair, your crayon, and let's write down, let's note down Juddy's top 5 tips for grazing fescue, and we're trying to get round those 3 issues that Alistair has brought up, and that's the poor quality, or the perceived poor quality, the low autumn growth, and this perceived difficulty around grazing management. So the first thing I would say, and this has come from personal experience here, is we've talked about how early fescue is. My first tip is start early. Right, and when I say start early, it's earlier than you would with ryegrass, but particularly in a grazing rotation, it needs to be first up, and you need to come back to that sooner, because guess what? It's actually growing earlier than everything else. So my first message is start early in the spring, and earlier than you would with a ryegrass. So you've got to get on top of it early. A lot of the situations we see is the fact that that hasn't happened, and then you're always trying to catch up. It's got in front of you, and you have to do a catch-up job. My second grazing tip is to make sure you stock your fescue to meet growth. So you would typically say that this will be higher than what you would on a ryegrass, for example. And a lot of people who are using fescue go, we just have to keep putting more animals in to try and keep that cover down. So my message is expect to stock this higher than you normally would, because guess what? It's growing earlier in the season. So we start early and we stock it at a higher rate. I think the other thing is, if we don't quite get that right, and I've got this wrong multiple times, right? So this is not saying that you will always get this right, but the thing I would encourage is if you don't get it right, or you don't have enough stock, or you think this is getting out of control, use silaging, conserve it, take it off as a way of getting yourself back on track. So people say, well, I don't want to silage because that's, I've lost it. And you go, well, put your hands up, say you haven't got it right, but reset the clock by silaging. So I like that as an idea. You may need to, if you're not silaging and you've got some areas that haven't quite been grazed well enough, and this might be less of an issue if you have a meadow fescue, but if you're just dealing with a tall fescue and you've got some areas that have been poorly grazed, I would say that's the time that you top. You run round and you take that off, because if you don't, that's only going to get worse. It's going to throw a seed head. It's going to be more. It's going to be less palatable. So I think that grazing tip, or the tip here is, if you come out of an area and some of it hasn't been particularly well grazed, that we do go and do some topping in there, take that off, reset the clock. And the other really important thing, and I think this is really interesting from a farm systems point of view, is you will find that there is not quite as much there as you think there is in the autumn. So the ability to reduce your stocking rate, be a little bit kinder in the autumn, will pay dividends in the following spring. So you think about this, it's going into a mode where it's putting a lot of reserves carbohydrates into the roots. If you allow it to do that going into the autumn, and you go, it's not quite on song, it's doing something, it's not growing quite as much, you'll be repaid in the autumn when it is has a full battery in the roots and really growing very, very quickly in the early spring. So just to cover those, go back over those, my 5 grazing tips: start early, stock so that you meet the growth, use silage if you have to speed up that round, top if you're not cleaning up as well as you'd like, and just be kind. Be kind to your tall fescues in the autumn. So, Alice, can you, I'm going to give you the job now, can you very quickly summarise what we've talked about, the key take-home messages? I might interject, and so we get a really good, clear summary of what we've talked about today.
So we've talked about 2 fescues, tall fescue and meadow fescue. We've described them as being fescue species with panicled seed heads, but very different underground, particularly. Tall fescue with big dreadlocked roots that go deeper, and meadow fescue that have got fibrous, shallow roots, similar to ryegrass, but full of alkaloids and goodies that are protecting them underground. We've described that both species like fertility, and they are plants of high fertility environments, but also because of their resilience, because of the regions of the world they've come from, they do tolerate extremes very well, both cold winters and hot summers, and they travel quite well because of this also out onto other soil types that are not their natural place. They do well there. We've discussed the history of cultivar development, where we've focused on late flowering types because they are softer in the leaf, and then we've moved to the high quality early types because they are high producing and very, very productive, while maintaining the strong resilience. We've described those early flowering traits as being really beneficial for early spring reliability. Everything from fitting into cattle finishing systems when animals, high density of animals are coming off winter crop, onto an emerging reliable grass production base. We've described how it would fit a early lambing system. When I say that, I mean the first month of spring. Lambing system really well. We also described how it would fit natural rainfall and irrigated dairy environments, where your focus is on both second round feed supply, but also summer responsiveness in hot and humid summer conditions. I think when you look at fescue in its own right, it's come with a history of people seeing it with grazing difficulties, particularly breaking a traditional rotation to get back to a paddock that's growing more. I still struggle with why growing more is bad, and I do sense that the whole concept of a range of different people having to try and manage it as part of that discussion. But we've introduced the fact that we are at a place where we believe meadow fescue and tall fescue pastures in a mixture of 50-50 by seed size mixture is actually a really strong intermediate to get the benefits of the productivity out of tall fescue, but the palatability out of meadow fescue. And when you mix two things together, you tend to find you get exactly halfway between them. In the case of this, we seem to be above halfway for productivity and above halfway for palatability, which is a really good starting place. And if you have been a person sitting on the fence about, is fescue going to be my future if ryegrass is not meeting my expectations, the 50% Hummer, 50% Oakton Meadow Fescue style of pasture is definitely a starting point for you.
Oh, well, Alistair, I've just seen a couple of cows walk past the kitchen window, so I suspect someone hasn't shut the gate. So I better go. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Juddy. Catch you.